Viewers, welcome to TV Metro Mail. You are watching Chit Chat, and I am Imamul Haq. Today, I am joined by Namir Rahman. Namir Rahman is a Canadian politician, and he is energy and environmental policy expert as well. So let me bring him on screen first, then we'll get started.
Hello.
Namir, welcome to our show.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, Mr. Huck.
Uh, the same here, same here. Thank you very much. Namir Rahman, as I said, that he is a uh, energy and environmental policy expert. Namir worked at the Alberta legislature in energy and environmental policy area, and later as a senior advisor with Ontario Ministry of Energy. He was recently recognized as one of 15 smart grid experts who are transforming the energy sector globally. Thank you very much, and congratulations, Namir, for this recognition.
Thank you. It's my pleasure, and it's my pleasure to discuss issues such as important issues such as the environment and the role that we play in it.
And today, basically, we'll try to focus on climate anxiety because when we, read newspaper or read the headlines or watch TV about climate change, we often, see or we often feel concerned or worried about the future of the planet, future of our children, future of the our grandchildren. So is that anxiety, or is this is it real? Because we see there are many young people, even in some recent research found that the young people, they are quite anxious about the climate change. So I'd like to know that really this anxiety is real or not, and if it is, then probably many of our viewers, they might not familiar with the term climate anxiety. Would you mind just giving us some idea about the climate anxiety and the
Ab-
issue? Yeah.
Absolutely. So the term climate anxiety is actually something like a decade old, over a decade. I think the term was first coined in 2017, and the American Psychological Association used the term eco anxiety to describe the feeling or the chronic feeling of dread of environmental loss and destruction. And this is a very real thing in that people are actually beginning to measure the impact the environment is having on the psychological aspects of people's lives. And this is being picked up more and more as we go across. I think the study that you'd referenced was a global study of about 10,000 young persons
That's right.
who were looked at, who were assessed in terms of their feelings around the environment, and over 50% of them that said that they were extremely anxious or very anxious about their climate future. And this isn't just a young person thing. I think there are cross-cultural elements to it, as well as socioeconomic aspects to it that need to be recognized in terms of how climate anxiety feels itself. For example, in Canada specifically, Aboriginal communities have an environmental identity that's being challenged by climate change. And in places up north where you're seeing loss of ice or loss of environmental habitats, that impacts Aboriginal identity. So climate change is a cross-cutting issue, and not climate change. Climate anxiety is a cross-cutting issue. It's been cross-cutting across for many years now. Young people, in particular, are very cognizant of it. And the notion of climate anxiety isn't one that's just strictly Western, it's one that's felt in developing countries too, in places like India, Brazil, Portugal, and even Bangladesh, for those who are aware. Though one of the things that I'd like to say is that I think there's a socioeconomic element to it in terms of I think people who are better educated may be more aware of the climate impacts, and there may be a stratification in terms of the awareness around that and the impact around that.
Thank you very much. And I think that the research we are referring, both of us, we are referring the same research, in fact, basically. So that research says that according to that research, nearly half of the young people worldwide, they are saying the climate change anxiety affects their daily lives. So that worries me too much. That so much that daily lives. So how does the issue affect them or their daily lives? Do you have any idea about that?
So this is where I think it's important to understand the difference between anxiety and stress. And the reason why I can speak to this just a little bit is because my wife is a psychotherapist,
Okay, that's
And
great.
what she deals with is she specializes in people with severe trauma right now. But anxiety is really is a feeling or a psychological impact that arises from things that are forward looking and not necessarily inside your control. Stress, on the other hand, is something that you deal with on a day-to-day basis, where your day-to-day stressors and that are impacting you. And climate anxiety has a psychological impact to the extent that people are suspecting that it may have led to an uptick in terms of healthcare impacts as well as suicides. So that's one of those things that was highlighted. The fundamental aspect that I think that we need to recognize is that the world we live in right now is not the world that is going to be, and the world that is going to be for younger people is going to be a much different one, and one that they're going to be facing extreme climate events. And for
Yes,
individuals, especially people at the younger end of the spectrum who are aware of that, they can track that impact potentially on their lives, and they are concerned about how it impacts them. The challenge here is that if you've got something like anxiety, which really has a mental health aspect, it can bleed into how you lead your life on a day-to-day basis. It can lead to depression. It can even impact your political choices, depending on how seriously you think the issue is and how radically you're willing to see movement on that. So anxiety, I think what we're looking at is the tip of the issue as climate change awareness grows and the pressure to do something on it grows. And I think one of the reasons why there's so much anxiety is really the disconnect between the awareness of what's going on on the climate change side of things versus their ability to what they feel they can do about it. And they might feel that they're disempowered to do about it because these are governments that'll have to do something, maybe not themselves, and that loss and that sense of helplessness that arises from it. And that will bleed over to many other things.
definitely, definitely. Thank you. So I think let me just anytime. Let me just Malik Kabir. He is saying excellent, but we have another question from Maniruzaman Akan. Can you talk about GGS strategy by 2050? Will it be possible to go carbon neutral facilities? Please talk
Okay,
about carbon. Yeah, yeah. Do
so
you like?
by GGS, is he talking about? I just need a point of clarification. So the government of Canada has so there's the global carbon what was set through the COPE negotiations. Then there's the government of Canada targets that are
That's right.
supposed to be climate neutral by 2050. I'm going to talk about it more from the Canadian perspective rather than the global perspective right now. I think the global perspective is a little more complex. I think our ability to get down to carbon neutrality will require a lot of work. It is possible, but it requires a lot of radical work, both on the technological side and on the policy side of it. And I'm not meaning to get political immediately. This is one of those things that I've disagreed with in terms of the current government's approach to climate change. To put it in perspective, Canada produces about 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Everybody says it's very small, but when you consider how small the Canadian population is, the impact is actually massive. Almost 1% of that comes from Alberta, and
Yeah,
almost 40% of that comes from the oil and gas sector. The only way we can radically reduce our global greenhouse gas emissions to meet those targets is really to keep oil and gas in the ground. And I think it's becoming increasingly clear that that's the only way forward. So whether it's achievable or not really depends on to what extent you're going to willing to do the credible things in constraining greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm not seeing it necessarily in the current plan. Um, and to give you an example of why it's so critical, the biggest greenhouse gas emissions, the biggest climate change initiative that was done in Canada was actually done by the Wynne government. And what it was the shutdown of the coal power plants in Ontario. That led to a massive reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in terms of its year-on-year impact. But in total, that impact never showed on Canadian in terms of our emissions, because as Ontario's emissions situation improved because of the removal of coal plants, Alberta increased its oil and gas production to offset that. So we ended up exactly where we were. So I know that if we're going to go towards carbon neutrality by 2050, we have to work on it a lot more aggressively, and that change has to be a lot more radical. The problem is Politicians are oftentimes afraid to make those hard decisions for political purposes, for immediate purposes, and it's tough to get them to do the tough things that need to happen now to get us to that better future.
I think we understand that whenever we talk about the climate change, many people they think that this is a very technical issue and that is not going to affect us in any way. So
Yeah,
in near future, that is the a group of people's
yeah,
perception is like that. But we know that the climate change and its effects are not universally or uniformly felt everywhere. In some part of the
yeah,
world, people they are having severe impact by the climate change, and the other part of the world or the class of people, they are not having the same kind of impact from the climate change. So how can we make sure that the climate anxiety, because many
hmm,
people they are quite anxious about what is going to happen in
yeah,
future. So how can we make sure that that climate anxiety is harnessed for climate justice, so that equally
yeah.
everybody can, yeah. So if you just throw some light on this.
Sure. That in some ways is a much more complicated question because I think everybody understands that climate is an issue. I think that a lot of people are feeling climate anxiety, but the step between how they're feeling towards their actions, which I call agency, is a lot less clear. Now, when I was doing some of my background research, I came across two really good organizations or really interesting organizations. One was called the Climate Psychology Alliance that's based out of the United States, and they're psychologists who specialize in the climate change aspect of, who specialize in terms of climate anxiety. But their approach is that their therapy should be able to lead to climate some kind of climate action. Um, and the disconnect, on the other hand, sometimes is that their means of bringing control back to an individual's life could be micro level issues. Micro level issues being plant more trees, be more aware, watch what you're buying, reduce your meat consumption, whatever that is. There's another network that I came across during my research that's called the Good Grief Network that uses a 10-step psychological approach for individuals to go ahead and rebalance themselves if they're feeling climate anxiety. And they've reached out to 15 different countries, and they've dealt with over 1,000 individuals in dealing with this. But again, their approach is very, very, very locally oriented, and they've got 5 or 6 programs and steps that they do. I think what we need is for us to be able to take that grief and that awareness and that concern and translate that higher into definitive political action. Because every year, so I've run in 3 federal elections in the Niagara region on behalf of the NDP. And each year, I mean, in the last, not this past election, the prior election, the youth in particular were talking about climate change. Every kid I met.
That's
In
what,
this
yeah.
election, what changed was that every person, not youth, that I met, regardless of political identity, spoke about climate being important. And you're beginning to see that awareness come up. But that awareness needs to translate into we are going to vote on this issue and we are going to vote decisively on this issue if you want to harness your concern about the environment and anxiety and then channel it outwards to definitive action. And I think what we see in places, especially in places like Europe, where we see what the extinction movement, that's where that harnessing is beginning to come into play. But it really requires that mass uptake for individuals to take their concerns and their anxiety and then push it into the public spectrum. I don't think local is going to work anymore. I think we need to. It all has to be national engagement for this to push through. The only disappointing thing about the last election was the disappearance of the Green vote, specifically with the collapse or the infighting in the Green Party. They went from about 7% of the vote to less than 2% of the vote. And I think that was just on the poor showing of the Green Party's internal dynamics. I would have loved to have seen that environmental vote come up and express itself very much this election. I think that makes for a more dynamic play, and it keeps other political parties honest in terms of what they've committed versus what they've delivered, because the Liberal government hasn't delivered over the last 6 years.
Okay. So before I move to our next question, I think we have a few comments. Let me just bring that on screen as well. Gulam Hilali,
Mhm.
he's saying that in micro level, what citizens can do to address this climate anxiety, and what would it be a significant impact. So we'll talk about that.
Sure.
I have kind of similar kind of question as well. And again, Moniruzaman Akan is saying, as per study, you see, again, he is saying that GHG is less using, because when we talk about climate change, we use so many, acronyms, and, so people get confused sometimes. So the
Yeah.
layman, it is very difficult for them to understand. Like he is saying that the GHG is less by using electricity, but cost is high. On the other
Mhm.
hand, NG emitted less GHG to meet GGS target, how to handle by use of fuel. So if you just clarify those things for the general people, the layman, that would be
Okay.
great.
So if I understood the statement properly, and if you could just pop that up again, I don't know if you can pop it up again so that I
Yeah,
can
yeah,
see it.
yeah,
So greenhouse gases use less by electricity, but the cost is the greenhouse gas. Greenhouse gas emissions really depend on your fuel source in your grid. So if you're using coal, your impact is going to be massive. If you're not using coal, if you're using nuclear, if you're using gas, if you're using renewables, your impact is a lot less. Ontario's greenhouse gas sector, or Ontario's energy sector, is very, very efficient. It produces fewer than 400 parts per million in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but that's not the rest of the world. And the rest of the world really needs to get into that space. And by fuel, it's not just the electricity side of it, it's also energy. It's your cars, it's your boats, it's your transportation. These are all elements that come in together and build that total greenhouse gas picture. In terms of the production of electricity, yeah, there are two ways of looking at it. Yes, the cost of energy has gone up in the last little while because everybody is talking about the transition, and that's the bad news. The good news is there's a transition, that everybody is saying we need a cleaner grid. And I think there's going to be a little bit of that messiness as they move forward. In Europe, that's partially spurred by they're moving away from nuclear. That's not necessarily going to happen in Canada. But one of the things that people don't realize is that the cleanest form of energy right now, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, renewables, is also the cheapest form of emission. That the cost of wind and solar is way cheaper than the cost of new gas or new coal or new nuclear. And I'll give you an example how cheap it is. In Los Angeles, there's this project going on where they've taken, I think it's 400 megawatts of solar backed up by lithium ion batteries, and they're going to pump this into the Los Angeles electricity grid. But they're pumping it at 4 cents a kilowatt hour. And to give you an idea of how cheap that is, the bottom rate of Ontario's time of use pricing is 10 cents a kilowatt hour. So 400 megawatts of solar is way cheaper than an equivalent amount that would come in from a dirty system. Another example in Alberta, they're contracting 300 megawatts, or they contracted 300 megawatts of wind at 3.9 cents a kilowatt. So that transition to that green energy for our own needs is something that needs to happen. We still have some technological aspects that we need to solve, but it is not only environmentally better, but it is also on a cost basis cheaper for us to go down that path, especially now. The cost of renewables has dropped 80% in the last decade, and that's tremendous. So, was there anything else to the question that I missed?
I think he also asked that put your comments on carbon shadow price too. So
Carbon shadow price. So, are we talking about a carbon market?
probably yes. I don't know what he wanted to know basically. But anyway, so
Yeah,
let us move to our next question, and then
sure,
if there is any clarification, we can just
sure.
do that later on. So as you said that we have to act globally. Individual or the countrywide may not have that bigger impact on climate change things. So across the world globally, let us come back to that research we are referring, that across the world globally, regionally, even nationally, there we see different kind of programs, actions, to address the climate change. Despite all these things, this research we are referring, that says that nearly two-thirds of young people felt betrayed by governments, and 61% they are saying that government were not protecting them, the planet, or future generation. And again, 64% of young people they are saying that government were not doing enough to avoid climate crisis. So what is your take, and what more government or the UN bodies or global bodies can do?
So it's funny you mentioned that, because just today the BBC came out with an article talking about the UN's report for the COP26 negotiations. But the BBC article talked about the government's response to the report, and how governments of all sorts are trying to water down the report's impact and pedal back on their suggestions that we need to move away from carbon-based economy, and pedal back on the impacts on things like agriculture and whatever else. And the funny thing is, when you read it, it was countries like Argentina and Brazil who were saying, when they talked about the impact of a meat-based diet on the environment, they wanted to play that down. Saudi Arabia wanted to play down the impact of oil and gas and whether we need it or not. And all of these, Australia had the same thing, the impact on coal, and they wanted to water it down. So when you talk about people who are very, very uh, feeling very betrayed by their government, in terms of the government saying, yes, we got to do climate change on one hand, and on the other hand, they're doing things like this behind the scenes. Absolutely, they have every right to feel betrayed, and that's where that global action really needs to manifest itself politically, and understand that within whatever political system they have, they need that pressure to be felt. The problem is that governments are really good, or political parties are really good at playing off one interest against another and saying you can't have both. And invariably, environmental policy ends up at the bottom end of things. I think that's coming down to, at least in Canada, that's coming down to the point where that's not going to hold for much longer. The Liberal government got hammered on their environmental policy this last election, and they've got 18 months to show that they've got concrete movement going forward. If they can't show that, I think with the millennials coming into, not the millennials, sorry, Gen Z coming into becoming voting age, for whom environment is a huge, huge factor, um, that's going to start expressing itself negatively for any party that does not respect or move on the environment. And I do think that the Conservatives have some work to do over there too.
Okay, thank
Um,
you, Namit. Before we, before our commercial break, let me just take this one again. The Munir Zaman Akan, he's saying yes, because Canadian government says it, if your project is less than carbon shadow price, then project is feasible. My question: how carbon shadow price determined? Do you like
So
to?
this,
Yeah,
yeah, I can take a quick stab at this. So if I
yeah,
understand carbon price, shadow price, we're talking about basically carbon pricing. What's the price on greenhouse gas emissions,
yeah.
right? And this was a big topic in the debate, or in the federal election, as to the impact of the carbon cost, or they call it the carbon tax or the carbon price, and what the flow through impact is. So I'm going to use an economic term here, and I may lose some of your audience. The demand for electricity or energy is very inelastic. So if energy is here, this is the demand, and here's the price, and price goes up this much, demand for energy might come down this much, right? So even if let's say carbon pricing takes up the price of energy this much, we might find that energy demands really don't shift all that much. And the reason why it doesn't shift all that much is for a couple of reasons. One is the programmatic element. Do you have other programs that will allow you to switch over from fossil fuels into non-fossil fuel based or non-carbon based options, alternatives? The other element is, are you engaged in something like a carbon market? And there is no large scale carbon market in Canada that I'm aware of, where people can buy, trade, and then restrict the carbon credits that you have. And the third element is technological. It doesn't matter where you take the carbon price. If you don't have alternative technologies that people can opt into, whether it's electric vehicles or high efficiency furnaces and things like that, then what the carbon price is immaterial. All you're going to do is you're going to charge money, you're going to funnel it somewhere, or you're going to put it back into the budget, or whatever it is. It doesn't get us to that endpoint. And that endpoint really requires not just the carbon pricing, it requires the carbon market, it requires the programmatic elements, and it also requires technology to come into play altogether for it to be successful. And I don't know if that really answered your question or not, but those are the elements that I see.
Okay. it seems that we need to do a lot more to really address the climate change. Anyway, we'll come
Yeah.
to that one. Viewers, you're watching Chit Chat, and today our guest is Namir Rahman. Namir Rahman is a Canadian politician, and he's a energy and environmental policy expert. So stay with us. We'll come back with a short break. Stay tuned. Thank you very much, viewers. We are talking about the climate change and the climate anxiety, and we have our guest today, Namir Rahman. Namir, let me just take one of our viewers' previous question, which was about, let me just bring that one, Ghulam Hilali. So he was asking something about what individual can do. So we know that we live in a one planet. This is what we
Yes.
commonly, saying. We have one life and we have one planet, so we should not waste time to act on those things, if there is any issue with the climate change. So we need a concerted effort, definitely, as you are saying, and we all know that to address the climate change we need a concerted efforts. But how can we mobilize people? Gulam Hilali was also asking a similar kind of question. How can we mobilize resources that we need to address climate change, and how can we make our arguments about why we should do more on climate? Because many of us, we are sometimes confused that why we need to put so much resources to address climate change. So what is your take
I
on it?
So in terms of why do we need to do something? So one of the things when I'm campaigning, I really localize climate impacts for at least in the Niagara region as to what it means. And the example that I give is the wine industry over here, which is huge. There's something like 300 wineries here, and a large chunk of the wineries, or a large chunk, or a chunk of the wine industry here is ice wine. For ice wine to grow, they have to actually keep the grapes in negative temperatures for 28 days continuously before it's harvested, where they really concentrate the sugars to make ice wine. And it can only be considered ice wine if it actually is in for negative temperatures for 28 days. Something like climate change comes along, and if you don't get those negative temperatures continuously, then you've basically imperiled the entire industry. You can't make ice wine legally at that point, or you can't call it ice wine. Whatever you make, you can't. So what comes out of that, and what I've done is I've localized the impact in terms of what ice wine, in terms of a major economic driver for Niagara, and I've stated that this is going to happen. The other aspects that we talk about in terms of climate change and immediate aspects is municipal resiliency. In Toronto, all the transformer stations are undergrounded. They're underground, or not all of them, a lot of them. And whenever you have these mass weather events, sudden torrential downpours and flooding, the transformers get blown because they have water rushing in.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden you've got lost your electricity reliability. For cottage communities, things like extreme climate change, there's soil erosion and shoreline erosion that impacts the stability of their houses and the value of their property. The most dire cases that I've seen in terms of that immediate impact is actually in Alberta, where 10 years ago, when I worked at the legislature, I looked a little bit at the water policy. All the river systems in Alberta are shallow river systems fed from glaciers, and the glaciers are all drying out. And the southern third of Alberta is actually turning into a desert. And there isn't enough water in the next 20 to 50 years for Alberta to continue at the rate that it's going, certainly not to meet both your urban demands, residential demands, as well as your agricultural demands. So everything that I do, I put climate change in its immediate impact that's happening right now rather than it being future. And I think we need to start doing that right now and highlight that. Forest fires in Australia, climate change.
Definitely.
Northern forest fires here in BC, climate change. And that's been stated over and over again. In terms of what we can do, you start with the immediate and you can work your way up from there. And immediate could be how you lead your life, whether you've got an electric vehicle or not, whether you've insulated your home, whether you've got high efficiency furnaces. That's the immediate stuff. Are you getting rid of plastics? Are you eating a healthier life, organic foods, etc.? That's one aspect. And when you pull it up a little layer, then you can talk about, hey, what's my municipality doing? Do we have hybrid vehicles for transit systems? Are we looking at an integrated community? How do we reduce our reliance on vehicles? How do we get people out cycling and things like that? That's your next level up. And then from there, you can work up to, what are we asking of our provincial government? Do we have mass transit options that can get us from the Niagara region, let's say, into Toronto for work without having to rely on vehicle emissions and things like that? What do our building standards look like? Because that happens at the provincial level, right? Do we get high efficiency buildings or energy efficient buildings coming up over the next 5 or 10 years? Will the government provide money for energy efficiency retrofits? That's happening a little bit at the federal government. And then the federal government kicks in, and then you can ask, hey, what can we ask of the federal government from a climate change and policy initiative, whether it's greenhouse gas emissions restrictions, the climate market, or carbon markets, things like that. So there are a range of activities that individuals can engage in, and I'm going to say one of the things, the most important thing is vote. If you're serious about climate change, make it known that the thing that you're going to vote on is climate change, and then vote on that. But here's my thing. What I'm saying is that there are a lot of things that people can do to reclaim that conversation on the climate space. Some of it will be immediate to you, but as you work your way up, you can see different engagement points for all individuals to engage in climate advocacy, if you will. I don't know if that makes sense. Did that
Yeah,
make sense
I
to
think
everybody out there?
definitely, definitely. But I think the thing we need to understand that from your, conversation, from our conversation, that it's a holistic approach is required. It is not that only individual, only the local level
Exactly.
government. So let me just come to my next question. That we see that the governments, particularly governments of the developing countries, when they talk about climate change or when they like to put certain program or action in place to address the climate change, what they do most of the time, they just prioritize the conservation and the restoration of habitats. Do you think
Mhm.
these two, because I think these two things will not really address the climate change? What is your take on that?
So, if you take a look at the main drivers of greenhouse gas emissions, 10 countries, maybe 12 countries, produce over 75% of greenhouse gas emissions. Um, and it's not developing countries.
That's
It's
right.
of the developing countries, it's China and India. That's it. And that's because on a volumetric basis, based on the size of the population, that's where they are. And then everything else, they're Western industrialized countries that produce immense amounts of greenhouse gas emissions. So oftentimes, I think it's a false narrative to say that developing countries aren't doing their bit when developing countries didn't create the problem in the first place. Of course, developing countries are going to do their bit, but now that the West has developed, you're saying, hey, you guys, the developing countries, you guys need to do your bit. And you have to choose between developing and producing a standard of living for your population versus climate change. And I don't think that's fair at all. I think if we're going to gun after climate change in a serious way, we have to look at the people who are actually causing it. It's not the developing country. And for developing countries who have a developmental agenda that they need to meet, we have to ask ourselves, how do we allow them to meet their developmental agenda in a climate friendly manner, in a climate responsible manner? How, whether is it research and development, whether it's technological change, whether it's education and awareness. It could be sometimes a little bit of that habitat restoration. One example of a massive habitat restoration project that's happening is in Africa, where they're building this, what they call this Great Green Belt right across Africa to stop desertification. And they want to plant an insane number of trees. I don't know if it was a billion or 2 or 3 billion or whatever it was, but the goal is that with climate change, deserts are going to expand. But if they build this great wall across a certain latitude, and all the countries in the latitude are taking part in this, they're going to stop desertification. And that's a really great example of local countries, developing countries doing something real. But at the end of the day, developing countries aren't the problem. It's developed countries that are the problem. And in my focus is, let's deal with the problem. Who are the people who are causing it? It's Canada with its 2%. Everybody says it's only 2%. No, for how big the population is, it's a massive impact.
And we live in a one planet, so we have to
Yeah,
address that. It doesn't make sense that developing country or developed country, the planet
yeah.
is the okay. So we have few more concern, but before going into that, let me just ask you, since we are talking about developing countries, since we are talking about the impact or effects of climate change, so do you have any idea, or do you like to say something about Bangladesh, how Bangladesh is going to, like a developing country, going to severely affected by the climate change in future?
I think a country like Bangladesh needs to put climate change, and it has at its forefront. And my understanding is even within the IPCC, the UN group that's dealing with climate change, there are Bangladeshi specialists in there, and Bangladesh has a fairly advanced approach to climate mitigation. Their analytics team, based on my high level understanding, is top notch. But where I think any and all countries need to engage in is that advocacy piece. The problem is that oftentimes Bangladesh is what we call a net policy taker rather than the policy maker on the climate change front. So the if you take a look at what the worst case scenarios are, the bottom third of Bangladesh disappears underwater, and that creates what we call climate refugees. And they made India is never going to accept that many people coming in. They all get squeezed up north. The social dislocation is going to be immense. I don't even want to speculate on what the huger impacts that are going to come out of it. I'll approach this slightly differently in the sense that Bangladesh does what it can, but its international advocacy needs to be stronger. And it doesn't, but it needs to do this in conjunction with other countries that are facing the similar situation. About a decade ago, I saw one of the Leakeys, and the Leakeys are famous researchers, anthropologists who are based out of Kenya, come in and they say they needed to create climate preserves. And climate preserves basically mean as climate change changes, they want to transport endangered animals from one place of Africa and put them in another place where they're not going to be impacted. And my challenge back to him was, look, climate change is not created by you, but you refuse to address the main drivers of it. If you look at greenhouse gas emissions as a lack of a pricing on greenhouse gas, why don't you go ahead and say we're going to charge a climate surcharge on all of your tourists coming in? Or in terms of the goods and services that are exchanged, that'll help you deal with climate mitigation. And he would not touch that with a 10-foot pole. And I think that the serious issues in terms of forcing accountability back on have never been engaged in. And that's partially because of that power imbalance. But I think Bangladesh just needs to, I think that advocacy really needs to happen bigger and better as a coordinated effort between all developing countries and say, we don't want to be your policy taker. We don't want to suffer the economic externality of your economic choices. You go ahead and pollute, but our lands disappear. That balance and that conversation is a really difficult conversation. It is a tough one because if somebody says, "Oh, you don't like our climate change approach to climate change," guess what? No more garments market. What are you going to do? So there is that give and that take. There's that balance that needs to happen, but there it needs to be there. It needs to be sustained as a part of that advocacy as it's moving forward. And I think 2 or 3 years ago, I was invited to the United Nations where I spoke on the UN's millennium, where I had written on the UN's millennial goals, and I wrote about it from an energy and environmental standpoint. And there was this specialist who said, "Oh, don't worry about all of this stuff. Leave it to the West. We'll create the technology. Don't you worry." And I said, "Hang on, no, that's not acceptable."
That's right.
Where I think Bangladesh needs to take ownership is create its own solutions, invest in research and development, create the future technologically, put that money in because it's 160 million people, very smart people. Give them the educational opportunities, link them with the experts across the world, create those technological solutions, and let Bangladesh create its own solutions for itself. I'll give you a very simple example of what could have been a transformative technology, something called a solar leaf. And a solar leaf basically emulates how a leaf works, but using it, you can take a gallon of just plain water and you can generate enough electricity, just water and sunlight. You can generate enough electricity to power a light bulb. And now you can imagine thousands of households millions of households or villages across Bangladesh using nothing but a solar leaf and a gallon of water generating their own electricity. Bangladesh needs to identify these opportunities and invest in them. And when it invests in them, it's also created economic opportunities for the future for it to export. There's something called spray on solar paint, where you can actually spray on this paint. You can put it on panes of glass are on the side of the window, and guess what will happen? It'll passively generate electricity with the sun shining on it. Imagine entire buildings coated with the stuff, generating its own electricity. There
That
are
would be
lots of
great. Yeah.
solutions.
Yeah.
And that's where the concept of innovation becomes important. Where Bangladesh, if it were to prioritize this, do the research and development, figure out how to commercialize and sell outwards, not only is it helping sell itself, it's creating its next generation of wealth.
I think you have mentioned or recommending number of solutions to address the climate change. But why do you think that those are not being implemented in developing countries like Bangladesh? Is there a lack of resources or lack of knowledge or lack of intention? What do you think?
I think I think the developmental path is hard. I think, on a capacity basis. So I've interacted with the Ministry of Energy in Bangladesh, and I've talked about things like smart grid and whatever else. But what you're looking at is many orders of difficulty above where, if you think about where the West is in terms of how its electricity grid operates versus where
Yeah.
Bangladesh is, it's not that there isn't the desire, but you need skilled and qualified people that can do that. And then by the time you train, then you implement, then you experiment, then you innovate and get everything up and going, that's a years long process. I can tell you one thing right now, at least the government of Bangladesh is very serious about the digitization aspect of it on the electricity side, on the infrastructural development side, and all of that. And what it's shown is that it is interested in this space, but it needs to be a lot more holistic. It needs to, first of all, there's just that growth time for you to build the capacity, and then there's the implementation side once you've built the capacity. That's something you can't short circuit. That's not 1 year. It's a 5 year project, a 10-year project, a 15-year project, and it requires that dedication from the government, and it requires us as experts and expatriates to say, hey, we can help you. And I presented to the government on smart grid a few years ago. I said, hey, you can help you, but here are your opportunities. Here are the things that can help you. Excuse me. So, and this is an ongoing conversation. It's not a single conversation. It's dozens of conversations that need to happen, and dozens of advocacy points to say we can change. And I think sometimes you just need to sometimes give the minister, a little bit of a shove and say, we can do this. Here's how you can do it. Here are your options, and then help the bureaucracy, help the technical experts get to where they need to get. And one of the things that I try to do when I go back and I have those conversations is I try to link them with the relevant experts that can build up the capacity. Because I think Bangladesh has to own its own solutions, it has to create its own solutions, but it can't do it just out of nothing. It needs that technical knowledge and know-how to be able to get there. And I try and where I can, when I can, I try and bring that technical knowledge and know-how and connect the people that need to talk for that to happen.
Okay, thank you very much. Before we wrap up our show, let me take another suggestion. I think probably why we cannot use mass green public transit all over. I think you have mentioned about that. Touched upon those things. Around 34% energy used by transportation.
Yeah.
What is the political mandate? So, do you like to add on something? Or
I can tell you my personal take on this is we
yeah,
absolutely need to change our mass transportation system to alternative energy sources, whether it's electricity or hydrogen. So on my end, one of the projects that I'm involved in is creating Ontario's hydrogen regulatory framework. And I just spoke a few months ago to the Ministry of Environment, and I talked to their hydrogen working group, and I talked about the regulatory framework. But the mandate of the Ontario government is to move hydrogen as a next generation fuel right across the board. The government of Ontario is really there. There's a federal working group on that. The government of Alberta has put $400 million in towards a hydrogen research center. And something like green hydrogen has the potential of transforming our heavy transportation, whether it's the rail, long distance heavy trucks, things like that. On the other element, for smaller distance vehicles and for mass transit, it's electrification, and it should be electrification all the way. I think the space that we really need to push the government is to make sustained investments and continuous investments for the next decade in that space. The governments right now, because they tend to follow a neoliberal economic framework, doesn't want to invest its own money, and they want private sector to really push into that space. Private sector, unless they see a clear profit case or a business case over there, may be hesitant, and it may
Yeah.
require seed money coming in from the government to create that first generation infrastructure, whether it's hydrogen charging stations, electric charging stations, etc. If you think about the charging stations that we need just for electric vehicles, we're not even close to that. And one of the things that I like to say is that the electrification of vehicles has a dual impact. For Canada, it may be good, but it'll increase our electricity demands by about 25%, and that's a massive impact. If every house got an electric car, an electric, let me put it to you in slightly different terms.
Yeah.
The average house uses about 20 kilowatt hours of electricity on a daily basis, but a car's battery is 70 to 75 baseline kilowatt hours. It's double or triple of what we use on a daily basis. All that generation needs to come from somewhere. Um, Now, take that problem and apply it to Bangladesh with its, still developing electricity grid. Now add every single vehicle being an electric vehicle, the electricity grid will not be able to handle it.
That's
And
right.
what is a first world solution for Canada, and everybody says electric vehicles and all of this stuff will not work in Bangladesh. And that hasn't dawned on anybody yet. I'm sorry to laugh, but
No, I understand. Yeah.
there's this disconnect between what's a
Yeah.
solution here versus what's a solution there,
Yeah.
and are we really able to do that? So one of the spaces I think Bangladesh could get into is the hydrogen sector. I think mass transportation and mass transit based on a hydrogen infrastructure would allow you to produce electricity but generate transportation fuel sources independently.
Since we are trying to, capture the, the solutions in order to address the climate change, do you have any particular country in your mind that who they are doing little better than others, or what they are doing?
I think Europe
Yes.
right now is really leading the way. And that's a relative term because Europe, so there, when you take a look at, especially from an energy generation standpoint, the big contentious bit is where is nuclear going to fall in the grand scheme of things. And Europe, what they've said is we're not going to do nuclear anymore, especially after Fukushima. And now that
Yeah.
they've taken out of all of their nuclear power plants, they went, oh my God, we need to fill it with something. So now they're backstopping it with gas. And because a lot of that gas is Russian gas, they're now falling prey to the socioeconomic, the geopolitical situation between Europe and Russia. I think, as I said before earlier, we're in the process of a really messy transition. That's the bad news. It's messy. The good news is we're in the process of a transition, especially in Europe. And I think we're going to have to push harder to see that transition happen in Canada. And who knows what happens in the States, because it really depends on on who's the president there,
Yeah.
and what they manage to bargain and negotiate between Senate and Congress. And it looks great under Biden. Wait till the midterm elections next year, and we'll see how those politics play out. So I think Europe is leading the forefront. They want to produce something like 20 to 30% of their energy from wind. They're looking at mass adoption of things like hydrogen. I know they've got some big hydrogen experiments coming up. Electrification is big, especially in the northern countries like Scandinavia and those places.
That's
Some of the top selling electric cars are actually Scandinavian cars, like the Polestar car over there. And one of the things that they're doing in places like the UK, they're using clean power from their wind power, the excess power from that, and they're using that to produce clean, storable energy in hydrogen. So there are some interesting experiments going on over there. But that being said, this is the cautionary note. Last year, when the economy shut down because of COVID, and there were 4 months when there was no global trade happening, all the major urban centers and industrial centers shut down, we only saw a 5% drop in global greenhouse gas emissions. And that's with the global economy shutting down.
that's right. Yeah.
The that is it was so disheartening to see that the global economy could shut down and the impact was only 5%. So what that tells us is that there's a structural problem in our energy usage. And what it needs is that big scale structural shift away from coal, away from gas, to alternative sources right across the board if we're going to get to that climate future. And it needs to be at the local level, whether it's your own home, or it needs to be at the broader level in terms of how you generate, sell, and pump and store energy. But it's a massive problem. We're only beginning to grasp it now, and I think there's still, to take it back to the original point in terms of climate anxiety, there's a lot of things that people can do to bring agency back to themselves and then advocate up via their various levels of government and say, this is unacceptable. You haven't done right by us. You need to do it, or I'm going to vote for somebody else.
I think I wanted to ask you the question, but you have already answered that one. So, despite all these things, we are trying many government level, the globally and the local level. We are trying to address the climate change on our own way. So,
Yeah.
despite all this, those who are still suffering from climate anxiety, what would you recommend them to do? This is one question. Let me ask you the another one at the same time, and then we'll wrap it up. And the other one, what would you like to suggest or want to say to our next generation? I mean, our kids, your son, your daughter, or your children. So, do you have any specific message for them, or them to
Yeah.
act in a different way? Because as I have come to know from your conversation, it has been a really very engaging conversation, that we have to change our lifestyle. You are talking about the structural change, and at the same time, individual level, we have to change our lifestyle, we have to change our
Yeah.
food habits. So what would be your message to our next generation? That's the
Don't
last
stop fight.
question.
My recommendation, or what I would say, is don't stop fighting. If this is important, it's important for you. Just don't stop fighting and don't give up hope. Hope is something that I think that's the loss of hope that really drives the anxiety. That people take a look at them and they feel alone and they feel isolated, but they're not alone. um, and they just need to reach out. And there's the therapeutic aspect of it in terms of whether they need to reach out for psychological help, but they need to do the little things that help them reclaim that space in their own lives and then push out from there. And my my approach always has been, do what you can, but do what you can. That's it, right? If what you can is your own immediate space in terms of how you live, and that's all you can do, I want to say that's fine and good for you. And then look for those little spaces that where you can get engage again, whether it's your municipal councillors, whether it's your mayor, whether it's your MPP, whether it's your MP, etc., and engage up from there. Start with yourself and work out. And in doing that, I think you'll find new and creative ways of engaging the government. And I think the last thing is, and this is I cannot stress this enough, be political. No government will ever take this issue seriously if you refuse to be political or if you opt out of the system or the process. That's how governments work. They respond to pressure, they respond to political demands. And if they want to stay in power, they need to know how to prioritize your interests. And if it's climate change, make that known. I think this upcoming generation coming up is going to advocate like crazy. At least the people, the kids that I've met at the door are incredible. They're dynamic, and they don't back down on this. And I had a 16-year-old girl a few weeks ago when I was campaigning. She asked me, she said, "Oh yeah, well, you want to shut down the oil and gas sector. What are you going to do about all of those energy workers? How are you going to help them?" And she
That's
put
right.
me on the spot, and we had a conversation about that. I said the easiest thing to do is transition energy workers. If you take a look at the next generation jobs, whether it's green manufacturing, whether it's HVAC systems, whether it's home retrofits, that's the space where you can take somebody from in the oil and gas sector and in 2 or 3 years go through certificate programs and retrain them into the green economy. That's the easy bit. There are jobs there, right? But you've got to ask all your politicians, how are you doing this? And I'll give you a simple example. I talked about the hydrogen environment and the hydrogen alternative fuel. One of the things I told the hydrogen working group is that it's great that we prioritize hydrogen, but there isn't a single training institute in Ontario right now that can produce what we call an H2 certificate, a hydrogen technician who's qualified to do that. How can you talk about the hydrogen sector when you can't train people? So there's a lot that we can do. There are many spaces that we can get involved. But start with yourself, start with the little things, and work up from there. And I think you will be. I think you'll and reach out and find like-minded individuals. You'll find a way forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Namir. It has been very, lovely talking to you, in fact. Thank you.
It has been
Thank
an
you very much
absolute
for your
pleasure
time.
talking to you. Thank you very much for the questions.
Okay.
Have I got all the questions from your
I,
from
I,
your?
th- I think so. I think so. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much. I think if we have some other questions later on, so we'll forward it to you. So let's see.
Sure.
Thank
And
you. Yeah.
thank you. And just one thing, what I can do is I can put together a few links if your readers are
Please,
interested
please,
in
please
more
do.
articles,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Appreciate if you
we can
could
look
do
at
that.
from climate, from climate anxiety versus other aspects, and if they want to be informed.
Sure. Sure. Please. That would be great. Thank you once again, Namir. Thank you very much,
Yes.
viewers. We were talking about climate change and we were talking about climate anxiety as well. And Namir has put forward number of solutions which are available currently in this globally. So let's see how individually what role we can play politically. And I think he has emphasized one thing quite well, that we have to be political, because if we really
Absolutely.
want to have a big impact, then there is no other option but to engage in the political system. We have to change the whole structure. Thank you
Yes.
very much, Namir, and viewers. Thank you very much for staying with us. In our next, we'll invite you. Please be with us in our next show. We'll bring new guests with new issue. Until then, please take care and stay well. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you again. You take care.